Hello, my name is Michael Valdez. I am presenting on the next contemporary issue in law enforcement and public safety. And I think it goes without saying that technology has taken over a new wave of capabilities for law enforcement, and which with that has brought some challenges uh, legally, ethically, and public perception wise. So, the title here is Drone First Responder Programs, an application for a successful future. The date today is October 20th, and it is about 3:06. So, first, we should start by saying what is a drone? Drones are the slang or common term for an unmanned aerial, or I'm sorry, unmanned aircraft system. The aircraft operates essentially without a human pilot on board, typically seen in the military with larger planes that can be remotely controlled. But now that they have been able to be much smaller and remotely controlled, the commercial use and law enforcement use has skyrocketed. So the drones in law enforcement, because they have a relatively compact UAS, unmanned aircraft system that can be flown remotely from practically anywhere, that can transmit live video feed to the operator or other viewers, and that is highly, highly important. It's one thing to fly a drone. The next thing is to be able to see what that drone can see, and that's really the advantage here. So why are they valuable, and why law enforcement? Drones give the operator the ability to view areas they normally would not gain access to, or without having to send humans into a potentially risky situation. Drones give the operator the ability to conduct risk management, survey an area, identify potential hazards, uncover issues normally not seen without having to spend thousands of dollars to fly a plane. It's additionally it's cost effective uh, because that you don't have to fly a plane or do some uh, kind of fly a helicopter, which although law enforcement has the ability to do, that has an added cost to it. Some law enforcement applications, you can locate suspects not normally seen on the ground, you can arrive at scenes to evaluate needs uh, prior to human arrival and access areas without being physically present, which is inherently safer and reduces risk. But what is the issue here? Why is it going to be a point of conversation for the future? Well, you have to look at the Fourth Amendment, which obviously is the right to people to have be free of unreasonable search and seizure. And so, is flying a drone in certain areas can be that it's considered unreasonable searching and seizing of private property. We have to kind of define what an invasion of privacy is when it comes to drones. Although we can fly them in the sky, uh, is that intruding too far into what people have that expectation of privacy? Um, the Obviously this will relate to drones in law enforcement, and we're going to be talking about proper documentation of law enforcement action. So, for some historical context, the first reported drone use was in Hayes County, Texas. A civilian drone was used to attempt to locate special education teacher Margaret White after she had gone missing. Although the search itself was unsuccessful, drone footage revealed that it had captured where her body, where her remains was prior to the use of cadaver dogs. So, although they did not catch it at the time, after reviewing the video on the drone, it did capture where she was, which would have led to quicker response. And then it's also important to note that there's a large commercial use for it. And I think when it comes to um, legislation, we have to consider, and public perception, we have to consider how the public can use this. If the public is able to do certain things, why couldn't law enforcement do that? So since the 2010s, drones have been used for an array of different reasons, including but not limited to building inspections, geographical mapping, or for media purposes. Drones and law enforcement have been relatively late to the game. Different companies are using it, testing the limits of reason to obtain information. For example, on a personal note, I responded to a call where a gentleman from homes.com was using the drones to take flyover videos of schools. So the company can share the look, the location, the proximity of the school to potential home buyers in the area, which obviously raised some concerns from not only the schools, but public and parents because students were on campus and engaging in normal school time behavior. But uh, this gentleman who had no relation to the school was flying a drone over them. Tested the limits of privacy because the pilot and the company are looking down on private property and juveniles. So the question I wanted to pose is, if this is allowed, what would limit a potential sex predator from doing the same? So I think these are questions that law enforcement and the public will have to ask. So there's some other different drone uses today. Some traffic crash reconstruction on scene reconnaissance prior to tactical deployment, SWAT operations, hostage barricade subject situations, patrol-led deployment, forensic investigations, searching for lost persons, traffic pattern review, indoor tactical operations. And we see that the Chula Vista Police Department was one of the first to lead a DFR, that stands for Drone First Responder Program. And it was one of the first in the country where over 2 years, the agency ran over 6,000 DFR missions and dropped the average call response time to be under 2.5 minutes. The Chula Vista Police Department and DFR program has continued to perform since without seemingly too many issues. And then approximately 25% of calls for service were handled without needing to dispatch a ground unit, which frees up a lot of other people. The San Francisco Police Department website cites that drones have multiple public safety benefits for the city of San Francisco, including faster response times, increased situational awareness for officers, more precision, the ability to integrate with other technology, and many other uses. So it is, although the perception from the public might indicate that drones are used for spying, invading privacy, what have you, these are legitimate law enforcement, public safety applications of the drone that don't necessarily invade people's privacy or expectation of privacy. And so we see that some other issues, we see that the DFR programs, there are many metropolitan cities are near airports. So you need to coordinate with the FFA, or excuse me, the FAA, for waivers to fly in certain zones, and then flying near an airport. How does that relate to? And then the restrictions that limit law enforcement from doing that. So here's some issues in the state of California that we see, some case law. So the it was California versus Santa Clara police received an anonymous tip that Dante Ciarallo was growing marijuana in his backyard. The yard was surrounded by two fences, 1 6-foot outer fence and a 10-foot inner fence. making it not visible from the ground. Without a warrant, police officers flew over the subject's home in a private plane at 1,000 feet and observed marijuana plants with the naked eye. They took photographs and used them to obtain a search warrant. Based on that, they seized the plants and arrested Cirallo, and this held up in court. So this was, I think, a big building block for law enforcement and drone use because what is truly the big difference between flying a plane around a residence and flying a drone? In essence, flying a plane would offer law enforcement even a larger bird's eye view of the area. And then there was another one in Florida. Florida versus Riley, the Supreme Court considered a case where police flew over a greenhouse located on the defendant's property in a helicopter at 400 feet, looking into the greenhouse and saw marijuana. The court, in a split decision, held that the defendant could not reasonably have expected the contents of his greenhouse to be immune from examination by an officer seated in an aircraft flying in navigable airspace at an altitude where private and commercial flights was routine. So this is where that, if the public can view it and see it, why can't law enforcement do the same? And in California, there's two civil codes for flying drones. The civil code, and it kind of relates to physical invasion of privacy. You see, Civil Code Section 1708.8A creates a cause of action for physical invasion of privacy where an individual knowingly enters the land of another person in order to invade his or her privacy by capturing a visual image or sound recording or other physical impression of that person engaging in a personal or familial activity. The second state law relating to drone operations is the preservation of privacy is the tort of constructive invasion of privacy. States that a person is liable for constructive invasion of privacy when they attempt to capture in a highly offensive manner any type of visual image, sound recording, or other physical impression of another person in which that person had a reasonable expectation of privacy through the use of any device, regardless of whether there was a physical trespass. If the image or recording could not have been achieved without a trespass unless the device was used. So in drones, this is relating to drones because drones offer a peek or a view into potentially areas where you could have an expectation of privacy or an area that is not feasible for law enforcement to access, and yet we can fly a drone into that area and access it. So that could be something that could be used against law enforcement. The next state that I want to mention, because they've been have a robust legislation, is Minnesota. So in the state of Minnesota, state law requires law enforcement departments to report each flight along with the purpose. The use of unmanned aerial vehicles are limited, except as provided. They have a subsection 3, but they go into various exceptions, including aftermath of an emergency situation, public event, and the public event specifically states that there's a heightened risk to safety of participants or bystanders, to counter the risk of terrorist attacks, prevent loss of life and property, or in man-made disasters and facilitate operational planning, conduct a threat assessment, collect information from a public area if there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, collect information for crash reconstruction over public area for training, for purposes unrelated to law enforcement, the request of government entity, provided the government entity makes a request. So they can do it for some other entity like a fire department or what have you. And I find this was incredibly important because this is passed and enacted state legislation that appears fairly reasonable. There doesn't seem to be too many risk factors, but this is kind of laying the groundwork for law enforcement's involvement in drones and when they can and cannot use it. The state of California currently does not have anything like this, but I could definitely see them copying what Minnesota does. And then documentation. This is important. A law enforcement agency must document each use of a UAV, connect each deployment to a unique case number, provide a factual basis for the use of a UAV, that's an unmanned aerial um, vehicle, and identify the applicable exception of the exceptions that I had just described. And I will go into more detail as to why the documentation is important in law enforcement. I'll go into that in just a second. And then finally is the policy requirements for the state of Minnesota. Prior to any kind of DFR program, the state or local law enforcement agency must have a policy regarding it. And so they are dictated not just by state law, but by the policy. And it must be accessible to the public. So obviously, we've kind of tied in some ethical and privacy concerns with the Fourth Amendment, free of unreasonable searches and seizures, some right to privacy, some government overwatch potential, and equipping drones with lethal or non-lethal weapons. This is an issue that has been a counter argument for drones, that law enforcement is going to use drones seemingly at random to either patrol backyards, inside of houses, or to spy on people, track their movements without warrants, without seemingly other cause to do so. So we wonder, the question I pose is, how far is too far? The interesting one that I noticed was equipping drones with lethal or non-lethal weapons. In my experience, I have not seen any kind of practical law enforcement use for that, but I would not be surprised if that becomes available. Being able to inject chemical agents, other kinds of distractionary devices on drones that can be used to maintain officer safety and preserve human life while accomplishing the same goal as a human would need to do that. And for the government overwatch topic, it has already been common practice relating this to flock cameras, where flock seemingly is tracking or capturing license plates on vehicles, no matter whether there is a crime or not. They are capturing those images, the locations, the license plates, and recording that for a specific amount of time. So I could see people relying on flock rules and trying to mimic that in terms of documentation and in terms of preservation of data. So we should also continue to look at dissenting opinions, why this is an issue. It's not just law enforcement pushing for it, but here's ALCU. I'm sorry, it's a typo. ACLU opinion on drones in law enforcement specifically. They touched on it. Usage limits: a drone should be deployed by law enforcement only with a warrant in an emergency or when there are specific and articulable grounds to believe that the drone will collect evidence relating to a specific criminal act. I think that can be justified with proper documentation, especially the last one where there's articulable grounds to believe that the drone will collect evidence. I mean, video recording of someone leaving the scene of a crime is pretty good, clear evidence to me. So data retention: images should be retained only when there is reasonable suspicion that they contain evidence of a crime or are relevant to an ongoing investigation or trial. That's fair. I think that's reasonable. Um, Similar to our flock camera situation. Usage policy on drones should be decided by the public's representatives, not by police departments, and the policy should be clear, written, and open to the public. Abuse prevention and accountability. Use of domestic drones should be subject to open audits and proper oversight to prevent misuse. And weapons. Domestic drones should not be equipped with lethal or non-lethal weapons. I think some of these have the ability to spark some conversation as to practical applications and debates as to whether or not those opinions should be made into law. So these are just some issues that law enforcement, public safety leaders will have to kind of combat in order to continue to use drones in operations. So how do we mitigate potential issues? We need really good policy. As with anything, a good policy for law enforcement is going to protect not just the department, but the city and the officer doing that. Documenting thoroughly, as with our Minnesota state law requires, documentation is key because we can justify most uses of the drone. But when we fail to document, that's when people start asking questions and we start seeing limitations. So the documentation leads us to the justification of the use, but also making information public. People and the public want to know why we're doing things. And if we are secretive about that, they likely will, we will not make many friends and they will be able to, they will have more justification to limit our use because we're not using the drones properly. So our policy considerations, we have to comply with the state law, be considered of public interest, and have public transparency. So when writing it, public leaders, law enforcement leaders should be considering all that. The South San Francisco Police Department has a drone policy or a UAS policy, and absent of a warrant or exigent circumstances, this is directly verbatim from the policy. Operators and observers shall not intentionally record or transmit images of any location where a person would have a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as a residence, a yard, or an enclosure. Operators and observers shall take reasonable precautions to avoid inadvertently recording or transmitting images of areas where there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. Reasonable precautions can include, for example, deactivating or turning images away from such areas or persons during UAS operations. So, in essence, this policy is much more restrictive than state law, as it kind of hits on all of these policy considerations: comply with the state law, be considered of public interest, and then have some public transparency. So in conclusion, drone technology and DFR programs will be a permanent fixture in law enforcement. Their management, usage, and funding will depend on public perception, legislation, and emerging technological advancements. Drones are an invaluable tool to apprehending suspects, providing information, and maintaining officer safety for police around the country. Many law enforcement professionals believe that their ability to articulate their actions through police reports or public information is the main reason why legislation is enacted, limiting their abilities. Law enforcement is pioneering how drones should be used and properly documenting why they used it. They have the responsibility to the public to protect the Fourth Amendment while technological advancements become available. Thank you. And here are my references. Thank you for listening and taking the time to look over my presentation.